up and speak. He's going to share a little bit about himself, because I feel like he can do that a little bit better than I can. But thank you all so much for coming, and we're going to just go one presenter to the next presenter to the next, and then we'll do all the questions, as I said before, because we want to try to get you out of here at least by 7:30, maybe a little bit earlier. Everybody cool with that? Awesome. Okay, Dr. Luna.
Good afternoon. So I have 7 to 12 minutes to impress you. I don't know if I do that with a talk like that or what style, but not really used to being at the podium. I've been academic for so many years, and so I usually speak at the same level with students or sit down in a chair or that type of thing. So my name is Ronaldo, and I have a civilized mission in life, and it took me a while to find that. And that is a play of words, so yes, I'm a civil engineer, I have a mission in life, but it's a civilized mission. So before coming, I decided, because they kept asking me, are you ready, are you ready? And I said, so, okay, well, I guess I've got to Google something. So I Googled the word civilized, and it says, okay, someone that is trying to attain a advanced level of understanding in life, someone that has is respectful, someone that says, no, that's not what I need. Civilized, I'm using it as a verb, so I'm kind of dressing up as an adverb, so I'm dressing up a mission, so what is mission? A noun, and so I said, well, I already gave it the title, but what I want to talk about is how I came about and how I ended up being a civil engineer. And it took me a long time, longer than the 4 and then multiple years of advanced education to figure out that I really had an underlying mission in my life. And I found it through working with people and sharing experiences and doing a lot of service. So, as you know, we were at one time nomads. So we used to move and we would collect or we would hunt. We would live in different dwellings and kept on moving. So that was a nomad society. Eventually, we decided, well, maybe we can be more productive and start doing harvesting, planting, and let's start developing a civilization. And let's become a little more civilized and try to conquer the earth. And that's what civil engineers do. We actually take care of building infrastructure, taking care of the environment, hand in hand, in a sustainable way. And I didn't know that when I ended up having to decide, should I be a civil engineer or not? I kind of ran into it serendipitously, just by a sequence of events, like many of you are living now. I was fascinated with art and composition, and I wanted to be an architect. And all through my high school years, I was saying, I want to be an architect, so I did industrial arts, and I did a lot of art, and I did drawings, and I wanted to build, but it's all about the pretty and the form. But then I got into the functionality, and I went and I met an architect for the first time. It was a junior or senior. This is back in Guatemala, and this architect with a very panache, and says, you don't want to be an architect. You want to be an engineer. Everything that you told me about what you like is very functional, and you have not told me anything about color, texture, or how humanity is going to interact with the structures. What engineer would I've been wanting to be an architect all my life. So I'm going to date myself now, 1976. Okay, Guatemala earthquake, 4th of February, huge earthquake, 23,000 fatalities, and I was trying to become an architect. And school was interrupted for 6 months, and I went in my first mission. It was a sad mission. We had to take our corpse, bagging, removing debris, because the predominant material in construction in Guatemala is adobe and heavy terracotta roofs. That was then in the 1970s. Earthquake happened at 303. I was privileged, my dwelling didn't fall, and obviously I survived, but many didn't. And I realized with with all my science classes and my decisions of wanting to be an architect. This is terrible. This is a terrible natural event. And I came to realize earthquakes don't kill people. Structures poorly built kill people. Many people. And I decided I can do something about this. Maybe I can introduce shape and form into earthquake-resistant structures and contribute in my country to be an individual that can influence construction. Well, I wasn't going to do that by being just an architect. You need to understand strength of materials, you need to understand dynamics. And I said, okay, well, I guess this architect was right. I should be an engineer. So I became a civil engineer. I started my country, came to this country because of political reasons. I fled, and I continued, and I still trying to find my mission. I just thought, okay, yeah, that's going to be my career, but what is my mission? So came to this country, very privileged society we enjoy, and I noticed that every time there's an disaster, and even this weekend, very poorly publicized by our media, there was a tsunami earthquake in Indonesia. We heard more about the political situations in the Supreme Court. It was not really taken over by the media, this disaster that happened in Indonesia. But they happen, they're more prevalent, they're happening more frequently. And as I became a civil engineer, a registered civil engineer responsible for building safe structures, I continued doing this service, and I didn't know where it was coming from. But it was coming from my own upbringings. I kept volunteering to be, and I am a member of the Geo Extreme Events Reconnaissance Reporting, which is an NSF-funded group that sends a team of experts to understand and learn from earthquakes, tsunamis, or landslides. Because as engineers, you probably have heard that we like testing. We'll build something, we put it in a machine, we crush it, and we try to examine what is the ultimate load that this can take, or what is going to be the preferred mode of motion, or the preferred degree of motion according to the input frequency. So we like to test things, but we are unable to build a test the size of the world when the actual plate tectonics shake everything. So the best test is the real test, when a bridge is tested for dynamic loading and it collapses when the ground breaks. So this team of experts goes to this site right before, right after the Red Cross has done all the work, so people are taken care of. But then we go study, we learn from earthquakes, from the real events. And then there's a continued recovery. And we go to communities to see how are they going to become more resilient from these events. And say, well, why do I continue to do this? I've done about 5 of these. I have gone to Honduras for the 2013 earthquake. I was in the floods of Katrina, wrote a report to USGS. And I started noticing that, well, there's an underlying degree of a service that my career has introduced, and I am really in mission with society. And even when I was a student, I was a member of the American Society of Civil Engineers. And we did a concrete canoe with all these funny events. And somewhere there, the mission was underwritten, and usually that's a little slogan. They are actually the ones that uphold the safety of society. Because if we're in this building and we go and drink water, that's not a chemical engineer that is responsible for the water that comes out of the water fountain. It's actually a civil engineer. A civil engineer and environmental engineer that specializes in making sure that the water is treated. Most of the water in St. Louis comes from a water treatment plant directly from the Mississippi River, is cleaned and is served to you by a civil engineer. Of course, we have mechanical engineers that help in some of the pumps and so, but the quality of the water is the ultimate responsibility of a civil engineer. And we notice the good things that, like water, that they can keeps us alive, and it can also bring us to a precarious situation with a flood, with a tornado, with a hurricane. And on both ends is where the civil engineer acts as an agent of good. And I said, wow, this is really serving society in an amazing way. I mean, we can build a hurricane-resistant structure or earthquake-resistant structure. Both of them are disasters, but both of them need to be designed by someone that has the tools and a mission to serve society. So as I became more advanced in my tenure as a professor, I stopped doing a little bit of this mission, going to the different countries, and so I said, I can't be doing this till I turn 65 or 70. There's something called retirement that I can actually pass it on. So how can we pass this on? And my mission continued. So now I am heavily engaged with Engineers Without Borders in trying to pass on the mission to serve others. And the majority of the projects that we're involved in are about clean water. And now not in this country because we enjoy clean water. We just came back in August with 3 students from Kenya, very much engaged with an orphanage of 21 kids that live in one, it's actually the one cinder block house with a nice roof, but the boys actually live in an adobe house of all materials again, and adobe house with a terracotta roof. So here I am, you did the math right now, way over, and I come back and say, my entire life was driven by these adobe houses that killed my fellow citizens. And I come back here in the middle of Africa and I see another adobe house with a terracotta. There is a lot of work to be done in this world. And all those that I teach, that I mentor, that I share with, I try to infuse, you've got to have a mission in life to carry you through. Because we are civilized people, we can be very nice to each other, polite, but we are also a civilization. And we really need to be able to connect with others near and far. Hey, I'm wrapping it up, I'm wrapping it. We really need to connect with others and humanity and use our skills to share so that we can all engage in a mission that's going to make us a better world. But believe me, there's a lot of work to be done out there, and I hope that you find that mission in your life, and you can bring in the forefront and teach others as you grow up. So thanks for listening. That's some of my story.
Alright, I'm Dr. Wojciech. I'm in biology, and that's a hard act to follow, telling you about your kids' mission. So I actually saw the poster last week and realized that my title didn't hold a flame to my co-presenter. So I tried to spice it up a little bit. I'm going to tell you about the same thing, but it's spicier. So my quest is for new and improved antibiotics. You could say that's my mission. So I'm going to tell you about my favorite organism, which is, let's see if I can, this guy right here. Same one over there. There we go. That is the player in my story. So that is Group B Streptococcus. It's a pathogen that causes neonatal meningitis. So I'm going to tell you about how I'm trying to kill it. And then my favorite molecule, which you'll see in the newsletter that I just got like an hour ago, that my favorite molecule is this guy right here, which is glutathione. Right there. So I'll tell you about how that will hopefully lead to a new drug. So let's get started. So my favorite organism, Group B Streptococcus. Fancy name, Streptococcus aglutiactiae. It is a normal bacterium that is in our microbiome. You probably have heard about the microbiome. We have lots of them. We have them on our skin, we have them in our gut, we have a bunch in our mouth. And the one that Group B Streptococcus likes to live in is the woman's vagina. And it becomes a problem during pregnancy. So during pregnancy, this bacterium is opportunistic, so it wants to It wants to get out of its niche and do some bad things. And unfortunately, its target is the newborn baby. So the bacteria can actually travel up into the womb, infecting the baby during pregnancy. But where it's mostly going to cause an infection is when the baby travels through the birth canal during birth. So as it is traveling through, that's when it gets infected. And this will lead to meningitis. The bacteria will go up into the brain, infect the baby, and the baby usually can't fight it off. So our current treatment at the moment is actually prophylactic. So what this is giving antibiotics to the pregnant mother prior to pregnancy. And then that way, before the baby is birthed, they will not be exposed to the bacteria at all. So there's a flow chart here that the physicians follow. If it's an emergency pregnancy, then they just give the mother antibiotics right away because the bacteria is that bad. And they do a culture to see if the mother has GBS, group B strep, or not. If they do know if they are positive or negative for this bacterium, then they'll give the antibiotics. But the antibiotic that is given is the very first one that was ever discovered, and that is penicillin. Is anyone here allergic to penicillin? Quite a few of you, right? So this is a big problem because there's not a lot of alternatives for antibiotics for this particular bacteria due to antibiotic resistance. So there are alternatives, but they have to type the bacteria to try to figure out if it's resistant to the different antibiotics. So this is a big problem, especially during a high-risk situation such as pregnancy. So, but it is worth it because we don't want sick babies, but there are some risks with antibiotics during pregnancy. The one is what we just talked about, antibiotic resistance. Pretty prevalent due to antibiotics being given in animal feed and overprescribed at times as well. But the bigger problem in our case is that antibiotics actually kill all those good bacteria. Remember how I said group B strep is part of the microbiome? So antibiotics actually kill all the microbiomes. So not just the bacteria living in the vagina, but the ones in the skin, the ones in the gut, the ones in the mouth. So it's pretty drastic. So here's what we want. So you see this nice bacterial diversity in this microbiome here. It's over here as well. And then just a short course of antibiotics, you can see that the microbiome doesn't repopulate for nearly 2 years, and it's still nice or happy as can be, and the bacteria is still there. That means it's less likely that our drug target will become resistant to antibiotics. So what we're doing now, this is my team. They're doing all the hard work. I have 3 graduate students and 3 undergrads. Each graduate student works with an undergrad. And a current project, what we're looking at right now with my senior graduate student, Elizabeth, is to look at how this glutathione affects the colonization and the microbiome population in the vagina microbiome. We're still using mice as a model. And then what we're also doing is looking at those macrophage cells, which are those innate immune cells I was telling you about, and looking how those cells themselves get killed by the bacteria, and how the bacteria will kill those cells. We call that apoptosis. So Abby and Katie are doing that. And then we're also looking at how this whole process is happening. So we're doing gene regulation. And we're doing that with my new PhD student, and that's Andy. And he's working with Kristen, my undergrad, and they're trying to figure out how that is all happening. So they're doing the hard work in my lab, and our mission continues to try to solve these mysteries and create new drugs. So thank you very much for listening.
20,000 people dying in an earthquake in Guatemala. Group B, Streptococcus, kills 1 in 20 babies in the United States. I just looked that up, I'm not that smart. It kills more babies in other countries where there's treatments and exist. And I'm going to talk about violent crime in St. Louis. So I'm a perfect follow-up to these, and to be noticed because we're all operating in this dark space. So what I want to talk about is not just violent crime in St. Louis, but a particular urban design intervention that only St. Louis has, and some tests that I'm involved in to see if it actually works. So before I get started, I just want to thank a couple of people. This work is being done with a colleague of mine, Dr. Jennings. Taylor and Kyle are two SLU alumni who are now postgraduate students in Boston, who are working on the paper that this is a summary of. And then I have a bunch of undergrads who currently work or have worked on this project, so thank you to all of them. But what I want to talk about, St. Louis has a bit of a reputation, which is probably not the slide to say the parents. Right, we have the highest murder rate in the United States right now. So it's higher than cities that are our size, other Rust Belt cities, about 300,000 people. In fact, our murder rate is comparable to cities twice our size, like Baltimore and Detroit. So you can see over the last few years, I tagged 2014, and then the last year the data is available for us in 2017. Our murder rate is going to climb back up. One perhaps reassuring thing is that we've actually had worse murder rates than what we have right now. If you go back to the battle days of the early 90s, our murder rate was significantly higher. And the other thing I want to point out is sometimes we talk about murder rates in the United States, there's discussion of something called the Ferguson effect. This idea that after Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson in 2014, that police in certain cities stopped doing their job. Decided it was too dangerous to get out of their car because they didn't want to be blamed for accidentally killing someone. What you can see, and so that is an explanation for these rising murder rates, rising crime rates, that police aren't doing their jobs. If you look at this, actually, murder rates were going up in St. Louis and Baltimore well before Mike Brown and other folks were killed by the police in those types of interactions. So that Ferguson effect seems to be a myth, right? That pattern that has been reported in the media. But we have crime, and it has been particularly bad. If you look back to 1985, our murder rate was still pretty high. Our violent crime rates are similar, right? We have the highest violent crime rate in the United States. Again, it's comparable to Baltimore and Detroit. I mentioned that if you compare it to cities that are more like us, we look like a total outlier. So Cincinnati and Newark are Rust Belt cities, have similar population mix, and their violent crime rates are significantly lower than ours. We've had high violent crime rate before. This goes all the way back to the 1970s. And in the 1970s, the mayor and the city government decided to try to do something to protect neighborhoods from violent crime. They figured if they couldn't prevent violent crime everywhere, perhaps they could prevent it in some parts of the city. And this builds on this theory within urban design that was prevalent at the time, which is called defensible space. This guy, Oscar Newman, was an urban planner, and he was going around pitching this idea that you could actually design away some of the risk of crime in cities. That there were ways you could design cities to make crime less prevalent. So we have our own version of it. If you drive around St. Louis, you will see signs like this everywhere. Street not free. And what we've done is we have systematically closed streets in the city of St. Louis to traffic, vehicular traffic. You can still get through if you're a pedestrian or you're on a bicycle in most cases. And we've done that to try to make the streets around these closures safer. That is the theory we're operating under. And it's baked into the laws that authorize these closures. This is a sample Board of Aldermen bill that authorizes a closure in the Grove, so Forest Park Southeast, that way from campus. And I've highlighted two areas. So one, you can see that the first box says what we're trying to do is we're trying to stabilize the neighborhood around this closure. There's this sense that if we close the street, perhaps it'll make that neighborhood safer. And down at the bottom, you can see that the specific part of the city legislation that authorizes this is this emergency public safety law. And this is tied directly in a legal sense to our concerns about safety and the threat of violence in the city of St. Louis. As you can see before, that's not exactly unfounded. Right? We have that particularly high violent crime rate. So what we do, currently there's over 270 of these in the city of St. Louis. We will take a four-way intersection like what you see here, and we will close one side of the intersection with some type of concrete barrier. Sometimes it's, I'll show you pictures, sometimes it looks differently depending on the neighborhood you're in, which is something as a sociologist I find really interesting. So that kind of simple closure looks like this. In the city's north side, this neighborhood called Vandevenner, there's these white planters that cut across the street. And they prevent, like I said, they prevent vehicles from going down. So these are called Schamel cots. They're named after Vince Schamel, who was the mayor of St. Louis in the 1970s, who thought this was a fantastic idea. So we named it after him. So this is just closing one side of a four-way intersection. Sometimes we've put in cul-de-sacs. So I live in Shaw, which is in South City, and Shaw is full of cul-de-sacs that look like they've always been there. They haven't. They're a product of the 1970s. And this is the end of my street. We've got this nice cul-de-sac. It's got flowers. Designed well. It just performs the same function though. Prevents traffic from coming down my street. We've also put in pocket parks. So if you go into the Central West End, a couple blocks to our west from here, there is a community garden and a small park that also is created in a cul-de-sac. And then some places like the Grove, we've actually closed multiple streets on an intersection. So the Board of Aldermen bill that I had up closes two sides of an intersection, just like you can see here. So it's got these concrete walls on the west side of the intersection, more concrete walls on the east side of the intersection. And again, the logic here is that if you prevent vehicles from coming down the street, it makes it harder to get away if you commit a crime. And so perhaps that street or the streets around it will be less likely to be victimized by these particular forms of violent crime that we're worried about. That's the hypothesis. So the map of these on the left, this is where they've been installed. Like I said, there's about 270 that are currently in place in St. Louis that we know about. I'm the only person with a list of all of these closures. No one bothered at the city level to keep track of where they were closing streets. Which I'm not from St. Louis, so that to me is ridiculous. But people from here seem to think that's pretty par for the course. And it ends up looking like a lobster. That's what I've decided to call this. That there's this body that sits in the west end of the city, north of Forest Park, and then there's two claws. One that runs through Shaw along Interstate 44, and another claw that comes down from Old North. So if you've been to Crown Canyon, that's where all these closures are, on the north side of the city. So they're very densely located in particular neighborhoods in the city. The neighborhoods that have these tend to have higher rates of owner-occupied housing today. They tend to be close to neighborhoods that were majority African American in 1980. And they also tend to have a couple other characteristics about crime that I want to get into. So I started this off with this idea of, how do we design space in response to some kind of social issue? The second question I want to ask is, how is our space built? And how does it affect crime rates? So do these neighborhoods with denser numbers of barriers, do they have less crime? The answer in St. Louis is no. So just in a bivariate sense, we'll compare the density of barriers in neighborhoods in St. Louis to the violent crime rate per 1,000 residents. And there is a moderate relationship, it's positive. So on average, typical neighborhood, the more barriers there are, the violent crime rate also goes up. And remember the justification for this. The more barriers you put in, this should make neighborhoods safer. So this seems to be working the opposite way that urban planners in the 1970s thought it would work. Now I can't go back and test whether or not this worked in the 1970s and doesn't work now. But I feel pretty confident in saying that it's not working now. And that when you try to model where violent crime happens in the city of St. Louis in a multivariate sense, the only thing that significantly predicts violent crime is the presence of barriers here. But this seems to explain other demographic factors that are associated with violent crime that might be statistically significant in other models, but aren't when you include the presence of these barriers. So I don't think the barriers cause violent crime, I just don't think they prevent them. So question 3, if there is this relationship, well, maybe the streets themselves that are closed are safer. Even if the neighborhood around them is dangerous, maybe there is some benefit to having a street that's closed. I call this the island in the storm hypothesis. That your little block, like mine, that's closed is safe even if there's a lot of violent crime going on around So on average in the city, streets that are blocked have a higher violent crime rate than those that are open. So it's not an island of a storm. In fact, the storm is happening on these closed streets. Again, it's the opposite of the way we would perhaps hypothesize it. Closed streets have more Part 1 crimes than open streets. So again, it's working the opposite way. But even more curious is this last question. And I'll give up. Barriers work differently in different parts of the city. So maybe this isn't a uniform story about St. Louis. Maybe this is specific to specific neighborhoods. So again, there's the map of barriers on the left, and the map of where neighborhoods are that have a majority of African American residents is on the right. This is a picture of what segregation looks like. So north of Del Mar, you can actually see Del Mar on this map. It's this rigid line where all of a sudden the colors get very dark. North of Del Mar, neighborhoods approach 95% African American. And a lot of the barriers sit right on that dividing line, which I don't think is an accident. So maybe some neighborhoods with different racial compositions have different violent crime rates, and the barriers work differently in those places. Poverty is the opposite. So this is a map of median income. It's the inverse of the race map. Highest median incomes in the city are in the southwest part of the city. The lowest median incomes, areas of high poverty, are north of Del Mar. Right? So maybe barriers work differently in wealthy neighborhoods as opposed to poor neighborhoods. The neighborhoods that have the most, the Central West End is the dark block there. And there's a couple other neighborhoods, again, along the body of the lobster, particularly the right claw, that have a lot of these barriers. So what I've done is I've looked for neighborhoods where the barriers seem to have a statistically significant effect. So for violent crime, there's only 6 neighborhoods out of 49 that have closures where the barriers have any kind of statistical effect. But it's a mixed picture. Right? 2 of the neighborhoods, closed streets are more dangerous. 4 of the neighborhoods, closed streets are safer. So there's not a uniform picture here. If I expand that out to Part 1 crimes, again, that's that wider view, so not just looking at murder, rape, aggravated assault, burglary, but also thinking about arson, larceny for a motor vehicle. There's actually 9 neighborhoods where the barriers seem to have a statistical effect, but again, the picture's mixed. Sometimes the street is closed and it's safer. Sometimes streets are closed and they are more dangerous. So I'll put up, you can learn more about our research. We have websites, the slides are available. You can even download the data of all the locations for these barriers if you want to play with it yourself. The conclusion here is, why might this be happening? Well, I'm not quite sure yet. This is a work in progress. But I do think there is something to closing streets and putting people at risk. A woman named Jane Jacobs, a famous urban planner from the 1960s, wrote this book and talked about the danger of living on a street where there's no foot traffic or vehicle traffic. That made you more likely to be a victim of crime, she argued. I think some of that might be happening in St. Louis. That by closing streets to traffic, we limit the amount of vehicles that come down at any one time, and it creates an opportunity for victimization, potentially, at least in some neighborhoods. So these are the types of questions I'm very morbid questions I'm interested in. I'm happy to talk about why I started doing this, which I haven't talked about. It's a good story. But I will give up the microphone for more questions.
Awesome. Yeah, we have a question. And if you could share your name and what learning community you're from.
Okay, I'm Joey. I am from the Honors LC. I have a question for the last presenter. I don't remember your name.
Chris.
Have you looked at police activity throughout the city and how that has any effect on crime rates and where the streets are blocked off and stuff like that?
There we go. I have a PhD and I can't work. That's a really good question. I don't know of any data that the city has that would allow you to actually really kind of concretely measure the volume of police police activity. I do know that the city has recently started putting policing resources in this area. It's called Hayden's Triangle. Hayden's Rectangle, Hayden's Triangle. Hayden is the current chief of police in the city. And it's focused on neighborhoods sort of between the body and one of the claws on the north side. And it has had some effect on violent crime in the city, but not a ton. And so, neighborhoods like mine, I never see police in my neighborhood. We also don't have a ton of crime in Charlotte, so there's two more hand in hands. But it's not clear that there's a relationship between closures. Are they being policed more in the neighborhoods without closures? I'm not sure that that's happening, but I also have no idea how they've been policed. It's an excellent question, and I appreciate it. Any more questions?
Hi, I'm Lexi. I'm from the Life Sciences LC. I had a question for Alexa. Have you looked at like the data of the crime rates in the barrier neighborhoods over time? Because I was thinking if you had the higher rates in the neighborhoods that were closed off in the beginning, maybe they have decreased even though they're still higher rated.
Yeah, that's also a great question. We only have address level crime data in the city of St. Louis that goes back to 2008. And almost all of these barriers were installed between 1977 and the mid-90s. So there's a mismatch between the type of data that we have and whether it's possible to look to see after the barrier is installed what happens. So in most of these neighborhoods, since 2008, crime has gone up. It's kind of mirroring what's happened in the city, which is our crime rate has been steadily growing up as we got through the Great Recession. Crime went up. So generally speaking, that's happening throughout the city, but we lack that address level data for crime in the 1970s that would allow us to see what the effect of the barrier specifically is.
My name is Elizabeth. I'm from the Life Science Learning Community. I'm from Dr. Danowitz. So with the birth canal being obviously higher in the bacteria, does cesarean section decrease that if they're not able to administer antibiotics in time? Does that help at all?
So that's a great question as well. So the C-section does allow the bacteria not to affect the child, but we see the same responses with the microbiome with C-section babies as we do with babies that are born with antibiotics. That is that they're not exposed to the microbiome from the birth canal. So there are some treatments that have started in the last decade or so, where for healthy babies being born in C-section, if the mothers are not positive for group B, they actually swab their nether regions and do a little like washcloth bath with the baby. So then they get mimicked of having that birth canal exposure, and then they're not growing up and having those inflammation disorders. So it is a good alternative to not infect the baby, but it doesn't solve our problem about the microbiome not being established.
Hi, my name is Grace Reeson. I'm from Micah. And my question's for the first speaker. So last summer there was a volcano eruption in Guatemala, and a lot of like Antigua there was like
was a very famous golf course called La Reunión, and where all the rich people live like Chimar. It doesn't matter, you just don't design for those type of explosive events. It's like the World Trade Center getting designed for airplanes running into it. Probably not. So very, very unique and unusual event that just happened. It's a great question.
Hello, my name is Jerry Irwin, and I have a question for Dr. Brown. The microwave university have been talking.
Yeah, usually an intervention of Indigenous borders is for sustainable design. So they just haven't tweaked it. And it's a little bit, right now, it's just trying to emergency efforts and trying to bring just water, like you bring it in airplanes, you give them water now, that's not a sustainable way of getting them into the future, to continue their life. So, and to answer your questions, no, I don't know many initiatives, but Indigenous Without Borders is present in the nation. So if there were projects ongoing, they probably got affected. But there is a difference, and maybe my talk will confuse the topic, probably very popular. These dramatic events due to natural hazards they really shape everything. And you go through a recovery, but that doesn't mean that after recovery that the design was sustainable for the future. Maybe you just had the Red Cross come in with a lot of water